So you're feeling, obviously feeling okay, well enough? I'm glad to hear it.
What days? Yeah.
It's the 15th.
But if I get email, I can. I don't think I have to receive the email.
Okay, just check on the website.
Email.
Around a good time.
Yeah, sure.
Okay. We'll just check the
For
website.
the event. So I know that's what I have to do. And I get busy sometimes.
Yeah, just now.
What did you say, March 15th?
Yeah, March 15th is
Is it Friday or Monday or what is it? Thursday from what time? 9:30 to 2:15.
Yeah? Yeah, Herman does that.
He's good. I like how you're, because Hudson is flat, and this is slanted, so I like that one. No, Herman's good. There's another person I like. Hey, you see you? Another person I like. Yeah, I'm sorry. I guess. He's not a specialist. So we were.
I know, right? Like, half the guys don't want to sit. You sit top down. I'm just like, excuse me? You're just like,
We won't take it away from you.
I know.
Now, if our sound room is working and our microphones are working, if all of our panelists will say something to let us be sure, we will be
Something?
something.
Something.
John,
Peter Piper picked a peck of pickled pepper.
Had to be different.
Steve,
Hello, hello, hello.
and we'll get back to Lee. All right. Thank you guys upstairs. We'll be ready to start. Good evening. Welcome to the Heritage Foundation and our Douglas and Sarah Allison Auditorium. We, of course, welcome those who join us on our heritage.org website on all of these occasions. For our guests here in-house, we would ask you to make sure that our mobile devices have been silenced or turned off. And as we begin, I want to note that all of our presenters are seated, much as Mr. Buckley was during all the days of Firing Line. The reason I bring that up is his one comic cameo appearance on Laugh-In the 60s. He was asked, "Why is it that you are always seated in your programs?" And he informed them in the line given, "It is difficult to stand under the weight of all that I know." So we shall see how our panelists do this evening. It is my pleasure now to turn the program over to our co-host and special guest from the National Review Institute, Lindsay Craig, president of NRI. Lindsay?
Okay, well, thank you all so much for coming. We really appreciate doing this event here. As John just said, my name is Lindsay Craig. I'm president of National Review Institute, and it really is my pleasure to welcome you to this series that we're doing on the life and legacy of William F. Buckley Jr., the founder of the conservative movement. We're very pleased to be here and co-sponsoring this event at the Heritage Foundation, longtime research and policy leaders in the movement. You have taught and cared for so many advocates, think tanks, and political leaders over the many decades. You believe in uplifting your friends, and that generous, very long view is in the Buckley tradition. For this particular event, though, I would like to thank our very good friends, Bridget Wagner, John Hilboth, and Rod Bluey. We appreciate your enthusiasm for wanting to put on this discussion and for assembling such a terrific group with us tonight. So Tuesday, just 2 days ago, marked 10 years since Bill Buckley passed away. It is an opportunity for us to not only look back nostalgically, but to remember important lessons about him, and particularly how he founded and nurtured the conservative movement. We intend for today's discussion and celebration and all of our Buckley Remembrance events to be inspirational and not just historical. William F. Buckley Jr. had a special ability to bring together a range of viewpoints and to unite a broad coalition of those who believe that a free society best nurtures the individual and the culture at large. And while it is inevitably true that the number of people who knew Bill personally will dwindle, it is our honor, our duty, to expand the circle of those who were touched by his spirit and influenced by the principles he championed. So we're thrilled to see such a large turnout here from all of our friends in Washington, D.C. We are here to celebrate this wonderful life and his legacy, what we learn from it. And this is National Review Institute's mission. Let me explain. Founded in 1991, NRI was fortunate to have a very prominent board with notable philanthropists like Gay Gaines and Rich DeVos, Peter Lawson Johnson, Dusty Rhodes, and Joe Donner, among others. They worked with Bill Buckley and John O'Sullivan and Ed Capano and Lisa Nelson to find ways in which a nonprofit organization could help further the National Review mission. Margaret Thatcher joined as the honorary chairman, and NRI hosted conservative summits and private weekend retreats, which I'm sure we all would have loved to go to, all over the world. They gathered their friends, readers, and supporters. By 2012, the NR board looked to National Review Institute to create new ways to support the mission. particularly important in an increasingly tough media business. We expanded rather significantly and reorganized to become a journalism think tank, supporting and promoting the top writers at National Review. Our current structure with National Review, Inc., a wholly owned subsidiary of the Institute, has allowed us a tremendous opportunity to grow our programs and spread the National Review mission farther than ever before. This fiscal year, NRI supports 12 senior fellows, 3 junior fellows. We run a program in 5 U.S. major cities on the founding principles of conservative thought, which Dr. Edwards leads in all 5 cities with an inaugural program on Bill Buckley and the conservative movement. As well as we have a robust on-campus program, and we host dozens of programs like this one where we bring National Review talent out all around the country. But central to our mission is to preserve and promote the legacy of William F. Buckley, Jr. And with editorial guidance from Jack Fowler, NRI will regularly resurface Buckley's writings and promote them as part of our Buckley Legacy Project. So we thank you for celebrating Bill Buckley's life and legacy with us today and continuing to support his cause. Let me quote from the recent issue of National Review where they had an editorial on this anniversary. Buckley imprinted on conservatism enough of his personality to protect it from triumphalism or despair. The lot of conservatives today is to appreciate what is good and lovely in our inheritance, to build on it and to protect it from both external attack and internal decay. To the extent that we can follow his example, we will do it with wit, intelligence, and good cheer, and with gratitude for his enduring legacy. I am so pleased to turn over the program now to Dr. Lee Edwards, a national treasure himself, who will guide the discussion among National Review Institute Senior Fellows Catherine Lopez and John O'Sullivan, and along with Stephen Hayes of the Weekly Standard and Matt Continetti of the Washington Free Beacon. And thank you all again for coming to celebrate with us. We have a nice cocktail reception after the forum, and so we hope you all join there. We'd love to hear from you on what you think about the program and what we all are doing in the movement. Thank you.
Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It's a beautiful evening in Washington, D.C., and a great day to be alive, particularly when we come here to celebrate William F. Buckley, Jr. Is it really, though, a decade since the passing of Bill Buckley, who wrote more, debated more, and mentored more than any other conservative in the 20th century, setting what surely must be a Guinness record? And we've all heard these numbers before, but it just struck me again as I was trying to put together some remarks, that he authored over 50 best-selling books of nonfiction and fiction, that among other things introduced the CIA hero, Blackford Oaks, that he wrote some 5,600 newspaper columns totaling 4.5 million words, of course, polysyllabic words, in defense of the conservative paradigm, and hosted the weekly TV program Firing Line that for 33 years, yes, 33 years, and 1,504 programs invited viewers to watch him eviscerate the leading liberals in the land. But his most significant contribution to the conservative cause was the founding of the magazine National Review. But it was not just a magazine. It was the epicenter of something that did not exist until Bill Buckley came along, the modern American conservative movement. NR provided a public platform for champions of libertarian thought, traditionalist ideas, and of course, anti-communism. With Frank Meyer's help, and how important that help was, Bill developed the idea of fusionism, a blending of the 3 major strains of conservatism, and persuaded disputatious conservatives to stop fighting each other and focus on the real enemies, Soviet communism abroad and overweening government at home. But National Review was just the first political step to build that movement that Bill Buckley took. It was followed by the formation of Young Americans for Freedom, which provided the ground troops for Barry Goldwater's 1964 presidential election, often referred to as a glorious disaster, and of Ronald Reagan's landslide capture of the presidency in 1980. But Bill's most audacious political act was to run for mayor of, what else, New York City. In that race, he threw down a conservative gauntlet to demonstrate that conservatism was not dead and buried, despite the Goldwater defeat, but very much alive. And he presented a conservative and libertarian alternative to working-class Irish and other ethnic Catholics repelled by ever more liberal policies of the liberal Democrats who dominated New York City. And I went back and took a look at his platform. And I just want to share some of the highlights. And note the political prescience of those planks. Number one, he said, suspend property and income taxes for all Black or Puerto Rican entrepreneurs who establish businesses in depressed areas in the inner city. Now, what is that? In other words, create free enterprise zones. This is 1965, years before Jack Kemp came along. Number two, require welfare recipients to do street cleaning and what he called general prettification work for the city. In other words, turn welfare into workfare. This is 1965, and years before Ronald Reagan brought up that same idea out in California where he was governor. Also, lower taxes, increase the police force, decentralize the public schools, and my favorite, and if you've been to New York City, you'll appreciate this one, do away with taxi medallions. Do away with them and allow those who can pass a test to drive a taxi. In other words, Uber, Uber, Uber. They say Uber alles? No, just plain Uber, just plain Uber. An amazing 341,226 people voted for Bill Buckley. And that political analyst, Kevin Phillips, author of the landmark study, The Emerging Republican Majority, cited Buckley's vote as a harbinger of the new majority that elected Richard Nixon in 1968 and, it must be added, Ronald Reagan in 1980. You know, by reason of his wealth and social status, Bill Buckley could have been the playboy of the Western world. But he chose instead to be the St. Paul of the conservative movement, offering his vision of ordered liberty from coast to coast for nearly 6 decades, and leading American conservatism from a small suite of offices on Manhattan's East Side to the Oval Office, and from a set of so-called irritable mental gestures mocked by liberals to a mighty force that has transformed American politics. Well, let's now turn to our luminous panel. That includes the peripatetic John O'Sullivan, who had the sang-froid to succeed Bill Buckley as editor of National Review. That's going to be my first question. How did you dare to do that? Catherine Lopez, founderess of National Review Online and queen of the internet.
Oh, dear.
Stephen Hayes, editor-in-chief of the Weekly Standard, second only to National Review as conservatism's preferred standard bearer. And Matthew Continetti, who is much too young to be with us this evening, but we've made an allowance for him. The rising star who has risen, who admired Bill Buckley so much that the initials of the Washington Free Beacon, which he heads, are WFB. John, you're up.
Well, thanks. Well, you asked. Sorry. Yeah, you asked me how did I have the nerve, the guts to succeed Bill Buckley. Well, you must remember I was a relatively ancient person when the offer came, and by that stage I'd done quite a lot of other things. I mean, I'd been brought over here to Heritage, as a matter of fact, by Ed Fulner back in '79, and I edited my second magazine. My first magazine was a tiny thing called the Swinton Journal. When in my first job as a junior tutor at Swinton Conservative College, I got the job of translating the lectures given onto the printed page. So I came here and I edited Policy Review for 4 years, 4 fascinating and interesting years. And then I went back to England. I'd been on the Daily Telegraph as a sketch writer, which, by the way, parliamentary sketch writer should but doesn't exist in the United States. It's the best job in the world. You write about what happened in the House of Commons yesterday as if you are a particularly acerbic theatrical reviewer. And you are therefore the most feared person in the press gallery. So I'd done that, and that was fun. And then I became, I was an editorial writer. Then I was offered the job, which was really a fearsome job, by Rupert Murdoch to be the editor of the editorial page of the New York Post. And you know, the piano player in the brothel, so to speak. And I thought it was fantastic, and I was nervous about that, all right. And then I went back to be the Thunder. I was the op-ed page editor of the New York, of the London Times, and editorial page editor. And I did that for a fascinating year until I worked for Margaret Thatcher in Downing Street. And that was a challenge, running uphill, running up the down escalator, actually, but terrific fun and so on. So I was doing that job. I was a special advisor to her when I got the offer from Bill. And I thought to myself, well, how hard can it be? Look at all the people who are working on the magazine. Look at Rick Brookhiser, look at Joe Sobran, look at Bill himself. There was look at Bill's sister, Priscilla. There was a star cast of writers, reviewers, editorialists, cartoonists, humorists, and so on. In a way, if you're the editor, all you have to do is get out of the way and let them get on with it. And so I did take it over with a somewhat exaggerated feeling that it wouldn't be that hard. It was, of course, much harder because, well, anyone who's ever been an editor knows that you never know when the next libel action, for example, is going to land on your in tray. And you never know when some error is going to be made mainly by you, which is going to cause embarrassment. But the fact is, the magazine was easy to edit because there were such clever, interesting and amusing people who were writing for it. And secondly, because history collaborated with me. I became the editor in '88, and of course the next year, the communist regimes began to fall like dominoes in East and Central Europe. I will just end on this point. The 1989, my first full year, held, among other things, the inauguration of George H.W. Bush. And the magazine gave a party to celebrate that and the day of the inauguration. And at the dinner party, there was one of our principal guests was the Soviet ambassador. And he said, "Oh, it's a great pleasure to be here." And I was a bit nervous. I said, "Well, you may not be so pleased when you look at the cover of our issue, which is out today. It's called The Coming Crack-Up of Communism." And it was an article by Rodek Sikorsky and a dramatic photograph of a picture of Lenin, which has been smashed so that the glass is being sent in all directions. And he said, "Well," and this is in front of a dinner party which included Jeane Kirkpatrick and the then New York Times columnist, whose name suddenly escapes me, who used to work for Nixon. And that's right, Bill Safire. And so suddenly the ambassador says, "Well, Mr. O'Sullivan, I think that's an unfair description. But if you look at what is happening, we do not have any intention of stopping the free development of the nations of East and Central Europe." He didn't use the phrase which later came into vogue, the Sinatra Doctrine, but that's what he was talking about. And he said, as far as we are concerned, if they want to leave the Warsaw Pact, that's entirely up to them. At that point, Bill Safire took his pen out of his pocket and started making notes. And Jeane Kirkpatrick leant forward in an inquisitorial way, and the evening was off to a terrific start. But of course, the year was off to a terrific start, and history was taking a major turn. And it was a turn which confirmed that what the National Review of Bill Buckley had been arguing all those years. And I was really just lucky in being there when the dividends came in.
Certainly, communism was one of the most important things to Bill Buckley. Catherine, what about his faith? How important was that? How did that invest him? Some people even gone so far as to say that National Review sometimes was almost a Catholic magazine.
I remember, like most of us at National Review, I've been reading National Review since I was like 10, we all have debates trying to remember if it was 10 or 11, and anyway, I have no idea why I just brought that up now. I'm doing a Rick Perry, but anyway, the point is that Bill Buckley cared more about just about anything than he did politics. Understanding Bill Buckley, it drove me crazy when that documentary Best of Enemies came out, because there is a smaller world of people who remember Bill, and so young people kept saying to me, "Oh, Bill Buckley, yeah, he's the one who let Gore Vidal have it." Oh my goodness, there's so much more to Bill Buckley, and as you mentioned, Lee, faith was a huge part of that. Politics did not. Right now, I think we're living in this world where politics is all we pay attention to. If he could go sailing, he would rather do that. If he, every day, as I understand it, he prayed the rosary, and Jack Fowler in the front row has probably in his pocket Bill's rosary beads, which Bill would probably appreciate are being used rather than being put on display in a museum. But one of the great gifts that I think Bill gives us is when you look back, and so 3 newspaper columns a week, his pieces for National Review, his firing line discussions, pieces that he wrote for Esquire and Playboy, and his best piece on virtue, for instance, was in Playboy. There was another one in Esquire. I sometimes make the very unpopular or jarring point that Pope Francis talks about going out to the peripheries to talk beyond, the chorus. Bill Buckley was doing that, Pope Francis isn't thought of as the most conservative pope, but that's not probably enough breaking news. But I actually love comparing him to Bill Buckley sometimes because that's exactly what Bill was always doing, and I think sometimes we have a tendency to talk amongst ourselves way too much, and that becomes more and more of a problem, as we have these social media echo chambers, which I've contributed to over the years, and have our great blessings, and we can get into that much more as well. But to understand that not only was he having debates with liberals, but he was also inviting them over to his house and having conversations and cultivating friendships. Some of the most gracious obituaries were from Bill of liberals who were well known in the last century, because he also had a human connection and relationship. And one other thing, but just a thought about social media. I'm reminded that Andrew Breitbart, who Steve and I were good friends with, died 6 years ago today, which is hard to believe. But I'll never forget. So Andrew would. These were the young people in the audience. Matt may have no idea what I'm talking about. America Online Instant Messenger was how Andrew would communicate very often. And I would be terrible about answering the phones. So Andrew would send me a message saying, Catherine pick up the phone. So he did that the night his Susie and his last child was born, who is William Frank Breitbart. He said, "I've got a WFB." He was so excited, and so and I mentioned that because whatever, and we don't need to talk about that Breitbart and things. I want to talk about Andrew. Andrew was heavily influenced by Bill Buckley and wanted to make a contribution to the world that was like his, where he was telling the truth and was making the world a place that he could look his kids in the eyes and said, I tried to do something better here. And so a lot of, and I say that in part because I think I dissed the social media and things a little bit. But there have been good foundings, and they came in the tradition of Bill. And I think our way forward has a lot to do with looking at Bill, and a big part of that is realizing faith and family and virtue were bigger parts of his life, and music and sailing and than politics were. So the point where we make politics everything, that's where we start to go astray.
One could say that man does not live by politics alone.
Right.
Steve, when you started, well, not when you started, but you're now the editor-in-chief of the Weekly Standard. What difference did National Review make, or has it made to you and, do you think, to the world of journalism?
Well, huge. I mean, for all the reasons that you suggested in the introduction. I mean, those of us who work in journalism looked up to Bill Buckley forever. As a kid, I grew up. I don't know if it was 10 or 11, but it was right around there. I started reading National Review, and then I took a subscription to a periodical that collected the syndicated columns of the nation's best conservative and libertarian writers, called the Conservative Chronicle. And it came every Tuesday, and I would race to, it was mailed from someplace in Iowa, and I would race to the mailbox to get it, and I would read his columns there and look forward to it. And you couldn't help but be influenced, obviously, by his way with words, his appreciation for language. It was reading Bill Buckley that inspired me to begin to keep my own vocabulary list. So every time I read anything, I would initially handwrite pages on a legal pad of words that I didn't understand, or that I might understand but needed to know better. And then I would sort of painstakingly go and look them up and handwrite out. And then this thing was, when I was sort of done with it, was 25, 26 pages, something like that. And then I just switched to doing it on the computer. Matt, you might be a little young to remember computers, but no one's brought my age up yet, Steve, so I don't think of you as that young. So he was a huge influence on everything we did, and I probably, of the folks up here, I probably have the most tenuous connection with William F. Buckley. I met him a couple times in my life. I was intimidated as heck when I did. He was as gracious as you'd expect him to be to a young kid who'd looked up to him for his entire life. But I learned, I can't even sort of describe how much I learned by reading him, by emulating everything that he did. And of course, then I started writing for National Review Online. I had worked for the Fund for American Studies with Roger Ream and Randy Teague for several years, sort of working in journalism academia. Went to Columbia's Graduate School of Journalism, got a degree there, came back and took a job at National Journal's Hotline, which is sort of an old school, a faxed, Matt, you might not know what faxes are, a faxed newsletter about campaigns and elections, and wanted to be writing the kind of stuff that William F. Buckley was writing, knowing that I'd never actually achieved that. And I started pitching really crummy stories to Catherine. And she was, I don't know, generous enough, gracious enough to run a few of them. And it was really what got me into opinion writing more than anything. The job with the Hotline was a great job, but it was mainly digesting other people's material. I mean, that's what it was meant to do. And so there wasn't a lot of original thinking or a lot of original writing, and it was supposed to be non-ideological. Well, I was a conservative. I was a movement conservative. I'd been a movement conservative at that point for more than a decade. That's what I wanted to be doing. That's what I wanted to be writing. And you know, getting my start writing those kind of pieces at National Review Online, I think pretty much everybody who's writing today on the center right had some connection one way or another with National Review or the website.
Do you think that we're concentrating too much on politics? I mean, Catherine was talking a little bit about that, I know. But even in the Weekly Standard, it's not all politics all the time, because you do have book reviews and other
it's not all
cultural
politics
things.
all the time. We've made a point to expand what we're doing in the what we call the back of the book, basically the final third, which is more culture, broad culture. We're doing more travel, more arts and leisure, things of that nature, some sports even. So I think to echo what Catherine said, there's no question. And you look at what Bill Buckley wrote about over the course of his life. I mean, it was most certainly not all politics. He wrote books about faith, wrote fiction. Most of his columns, in one way or another, incorporated the things that he was doing in his day-to-day life and experiences that he was having. Anything that happened to him, he could include in a column. And you know, many of his very best columns were not political at all.
Well, Matt, what does Bill Buckley say to the rising generation, to quote Russell Kirk?
First, I have to say how remarkably ageist this panel has been. I've sat here for 45 minutes. And,
running out of steam, though. It's up to you to carry on.
no, as always, you look to youth to carry forward. Buckley was amazing in many ways. I got to meet with him once, and I'm probably, to bring up my age again, I'm probably the last generation of conservatives to actually have known or interacted with him personally. The story I like to tell is I was lucky enough when I was working at NR for Rich Lowry, who succeeded John, on a book project. I got the invitation to the editorial dinners. So I think key to understanding Buckley is there's a lot of different things, but one is just the joie de vivre, the style of life. And once you become familiar with the style of life, you couldn't help but want to emulate it. And so you got this invitation to the bi-weekly editorial dinners. After you close the magazine, you go to dinner. Sometimes it used to be at an Italian restaurant called Peone's that closed down. At that time that I went, it was at the Buckley Maisonette, which was the duplex apartment on Park Avenue and 73rd Street. And so if you're a sophomore at Columbia, I was a junior at Columbia, I'm sorry, and you know, you're just beginning to get involved in this world of conservative ideas, conservative journalism, to be invited to not only meet the Buckleys, but also be in their Maisonette was extremely thrilling. So we went up that night. And again, this whole kind of tableau, this whole spectacle that was William F. Buckley, Jr. And we need to understand that the other half of the Buckley occasion, which was Pat Buckley, his wife. Because she was just as much a character as William F. Buckley, Jr. was. And so you're escorted into the Red Room off the entrance. And glowering from above the mantel is this huge portrait of Pat. And she was intimidating in art as she was in life. And the King Charles Cavalier Spaniels that he always had were running around nipping at your toes. Buckley's reclining in a chair, speaking to the house staff in Spanish, because Spanish was his first language. Okay? And the great man insists that you sit next to him. If you're the youngest person, always sits next to him. And what would you like to drink? Oh, of course, a gin and tonic, because that's what he's having. And after drinks in the Red Room, you are escorted into the dining room. In the heyday, there were 2 tables. At this point, there's only 1 table. You all sat around the table. Again, he insists that the youngest person sits next to him. Now, before the dinner, I had been warned. A young assistant editor there had said, Matt, do you know what finger bowls are? I grew up in Burke, Virginia, in suburban Fairfax County. I went to public schools. I had no idea what finger bowls were. She goes, well, you better find out, because in between the salad course and the main course, a finger bowl will appear in front of you. And if you don't know how to use the finger bowl, then you're going to get a nasty stare from Pat. And it could end your career right there. And there were, in fact, David Brooks tells a story that he had been at one of these dinners where he had thought that he was to drink out of the finger bowl. And no, what you're supposed to do is kind of dip your fingers in the bowl and then dry them off your napkin, and then they would take it away. So luckily, I passed the finger bowl test. But at that point in his life, and often throughout his life, Buckley, since he knew so many people, wasn't very good at names. So he sits me down, and of course the time comes to ask me a question, because this was part of the routine, the kind of routine of the editorial dinner was that the youngest person would be asked at random to comment on something. At that dinner, the guests of honor, the invited guests who were to dine with the senior editors were Larry Kudlow, the economics commentator, and Larry Lindsay, who at that point had just left the Bush Treasury Department, I think, right after he had kind of accurately estimated the costs of the Iraq War, if you recall. He then left. So the discussion was over international financial system. And sure enough, Buckley asked him for my opinion on this matter. I had no idea. But more than that, he kept thinking my name was Paul. So I tried correcting him the first time, leaning over, incredibly intimidating, say, Mr. Buckley, my name is Matthew. He kind of gave me a look. And then, of course, the second time the question came was, Paul, what do you think of this? So I was Paul Continetti that night, and I never looked back. I think it's important to communicate how singular a person he was, because I think the novelty of his personality was in fact the key to his appeal. And so I'm going to just quote him, because one of his weapons in this lifelong debate he waged against liberalism and communism was his wit. And I think it's painfully obvious that it's missing from a lot of our debate now. Some that I just came across. It's so easy. You can just kind of dip into the Buckley works and you find the one-liners, right? So interviewed by 60 Minutes a few days before Reagan was inaugurated, Morley Safer asked Bill Buckley, who comes from a family of 10 children, what would happen if there were a liberal Buckley? And Buckley, without missing a beat, said, I would pray for him. We all know the famous one where at the first press conference, when he ran for mayor of New York City, the reporters asked him, Mr. Buckley, what will you do if you win? And he said, demand a recount. There was a Robert F. Kennedy, during his ascent, refused to go on firing line. And they asked Buckley, why do you think that is? And Buckley said, why does bologna resist the grinder? I came across another one. This is from 1978. He was at Cornell. He was giving a speech as one of the, his calendar was filled with speeches. He was constantly traveling, evangelizing. And a lefty student at Cornell, after hearing his discourse on tax cuts, said, Mr. Buckley, have you ever gone hungry? And Buckley said, why, yes. My yacht experienced an unfortunate shortage of stuffed goose recently off Nassau in the Bahamas. I mean, it's hard to convey just how unique that was, right? And so he was an aspirational figure. And I think for young conservatives, now maybe Andrew Breitbart did serve that role, but the aspirational figures aren't quite the same. They don't combine the same kind of theatricality with the same type of almost aristocratic bearing, and as well as the intellectuality, right? With the most obvious way we think of that is through his vocabulary. The world has changed, I'll say that, but yet in some ways it remains the same. So the arch rival of the United States when Buckley was in his heyday was the USSR. Today it's China, also a communist power, which we're being reminded of. The central issues in Buckley's day were economics and foreign policy. Today I think they relate to identity and culture. The dominant media in Buckley's time, print and television. That's how he became who he was. The dominant media of our time is social media, podcasts. So conservatives have to negotiate this changed landscape, but I think Buckley's a lodestar in who we might want to, as he would say, asymptotically approximate. And we've been reminded also, just to the last quips that I came across, which in that same interview, Morally Safer asked me, he said, well, Reagan, look, you won. Reagan is going to be the president of the United States. Is liberalism defeated? And Buckley said, oh, no, no. Neither is original sin. We still have the work to do.
Well, thank heavens we have rising stars who are risen like you, Matt, really.
About to fall. You know, I don't want to rise completely.
Just, I'm reminded of just how intimidating Bill Buckley could be to the most high-flying people, including Rush Limbaugh, who was invited to the Masonette one evening several years ago, got into his limo, and they drove up to the Masonette. And Rush Limbaugh, the talkmeister of America, said, wait, go around the block. I can't go in yet. He was so nervous, he didn't want to go up and meet the man and be part of the dinner. They went around the block, stopped. And the chauffeur leans over and says, wait, do it again. So they went around the block a second time before they finally got enough nerve and courage to go up there and to be part of that evening. An extraordinary person indeed. Now, are we going to have questions from the audience? Or are we going to keep up here? What do you suggest? Are we? Okay.
Lee, can I just say one quick thing?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely.
So 10 years ago Tuesday, I announced on the corner on National Review Online that Bill had died. So for the next days, people would email me their Bill Buckley stories, and this is on the point about him being intimidating and everybody's hero, and so if you ran into him at the airport or he came to your campus, or lots of people had lots of different stories, and they all were about the same. He treated me so graciously. He treated me like I was the most important person in the world. I have no idea what I rambled on about, but he was so interested in it. And some of the stories, and so everybody's story was about the same, it turned out, wherever they ran into him and whoever they were. But then some of the stories were incredible, including the one man who said, I hope Christopher doesn't mind, Christopher being his son, but I considered him a father because I didn't have a father growing up in the picture. But he was on TV, this man I respected every week. He was there he was in the pages of National Review. I could rely on him. There were priests who told me that you asked about faith, that he influenced their religious vocations because he talked about his faith so openly and confidently. And so the testimonies people started pouring in were just testaments to, you never know, what kind of influence you can have if you're being that aspirational figure that Matt was talking about.
Well, I think that he was particularly sympathetic to and supportive of young people. And so I'll do a little true confession here. Bill Buckley saved me from myself. I was living over in Paris and then came back home, and I thought I was going to be able to write the great American novel. And I had written it over in Paris when I was there, and it was rejected out of hand, as it should have been, because it was a terrible, terrible novel. It was the worst American novel of the year. And so I wrote some short stories. They were rejected. I wrote some poems. They were rejected. And I said to myself, well, maybe the market is trying to tell me something here. So I wrote an essay about France and about the fact that, this is in the late 50s, that if it didn't shape up and pick a strong man as its next leader, that it might go down the tubes. It was a far, far cry from the days of Napoleon. And I sent this essay off to National Review, And I had never met Bill Buckley, did not know him, he did not know me, and yet he saw this article and he published it. He published it. And with that, I said, oh, I think I'm going to put aside novels and begin writing, political pieces for magazines like National Review. So Bill Buckley saved me from myself, because otherwise I might have gone back to Paris and drunk myself to death on the left bank,
Bill was
which I was
also,
well on the way to doing at that time.
Bill
Well,
was
actually,
also very insistent that everyone always get a response, so that no one ever write to National Review and not get a response.
Well, actually,
John?
just to pick up what you said, Lee, the first contact I ever had with Bill was when he wrote a column about one of my parliamentary sketches, saying, that the parliamentary sketch is a form which is very prosperous and prospered in England, I should say. Sarkey wrote parliamentary sketches, the writer A.G. MacDonald, arguably Dr. Johnson, though I think he just simply made them up. But nonetheless, Bill wrote about this and quoted 3 or 4 passages. And of course, I knew who he was, because as a student at London University, I had gone to the American Embassy and tried to get to read National Review. But they told me very sniffily that they did not keep magazines of that low character. So that only made me more determined, of course. But that was it was a great treat, to be picked up and written about in the United States by its leading conservative columnist. And just the final point, we're trying to divine here the mystery of what made Bill so important, and everybody's made, I thought, very good points. But I want to suggest that when you read Bill as a conservative, and remember we're reading him in rather discouraging circumstances most of our lives, you read him and you thought, they can never win. Against this kind of thing, they can never win. And that's very important, because, after all, most of the time, the evidence suggested that they could win and were winning. And he, in a sense, by his writing, his wit, his independence, and the fact that you knew he was telling all kinds of truths, and telling them honestly, but also wittily, and incidentally, in a way that, in my view, is inimitable. I always discourage people trying to write like Bill, because if you look at him, he had a corkscrew mind when it came to wit. It came at you in all kinds of different directions. So you couldn't really imitate him, but you could be inspired by him.
If I can just pick
Yes,
up
please,
on
Steve.
that briefly. The other thing, I think that we all understand just how logical his mind was, how precise his reasoning was, how he marshaled facts to make his arguments. But what he sought to do ultimately was persuade. He wanted to persuade, whether we're talking about Firing Line, whether we're talking about his columns, whether we're talking about the work that he did in National Review, he was trying to win converts. He was making an argument, marshaling facts, logic, and reason, and saying ultimately, come on, believe what I believe. I've made a good case, haven't I? And I think to a certain extent we miss that in today's conservative media, where it seems to me a lot of what too many conservative media outlets do is seek affirmation. They want to get people nodding along, and we'll get more clicks if we do this, rather than trying to marshal arguments to persuade people. And it's a thing that conservatives, I think, have struggled with over the years, and it continues to be a challenge, I think, despite his terrific example.
I think, by the way, just a very quick point, don't you think the same is also true of Ronald Reagan as a columnist and as a broadcaster?
And they both, I mean, in service of their efforts to persuade, they were able to marshal facts and use logic, but they were also both tremendous storytellers.
Yes.
Something else I think conservatives over the years haven't done well enough. I mean, look at the big arguments of the day. On the left, they often tell compelling stories or emotional stories that are sometimes, I would argue, at odds with reason and facts and logic. Conservatives sometimes lean too heavily on logical arguments and don't tell stories. He was able to do both and obviously do it very effectively. Yeah.
This is the question for the entire panel, that is, would Bill tweet?
I think he almost certainly would. mean, he loved technology, from what we know, and was always interested in it. He couldn't make it work, but he was interested in it. And so he probably would have adopted it. But one of his, I think he was very keen to the media available to him at the time. And so it's just the case that if you want to persuade today, if you want to, you're not necessarily going to change liberals' minds, but you may get that young person, right, who's popped up in all of our discussions, who might not be so sure about the way that he or she sees the world. The way to contact that person, to communicate with them, is through now Twitter, YouTube, podcasts, Facebook, the social media. So I think he would, or if not himself, he would encourage others to do it.
Of course, that's what he did with Firing Line, isn't it? Which was something unprecedented. Nobody had done that kind of a program, and he originated it and did it for, my goodness, 33 years.
Yeah, I was listening to, as it happens, I was listening on my drive in today to an old NPR interview with him from 2004. And he was talking about exactly this, not Twitter, but he was talking about the changes in the media and expressed tremendous frustration that, that we were forced to consume our media in ever smaller chunks, and talked about how he used to have 58.5 minutes to get through Firing Line, and then by the demands of PBS station managers, crunched it to 30 minutes. And I thought that we weren't able to make full arguments given the ever-shortening news cycle, and that's when the news cycle wasn't every 4 seconds, but every 30 minutes. At the end of this interview, it was an interesting NPR interview, but a half hour with him, Tucker Carlson jumped on and weighed in on sort of Bill's career and his life and his importance to the conservative movement. And at one point, Bill sort of expressed sadness or frustration on Tucker's behalf that Tucker, who was at the time hosting Crossfire, had to do those kind of debates, which in some ways can trace their lineage back to Firing Line, but in other ways were almost the antithesis of Firing Line. I mean, Firing Line was an hour of good, deep, intellectual exchange in a way that Crossfire was not. Crossfire was a half hour. It was, as often as not, shouting back and forth, trying to get a word in edgewise. And Crossfire, very different than Firing Line, was partisan. Firing Line was ideological. I mean, these were, the giants of American the giant of American conservatism, often taking on the giants of American liberalism. Crossfire, people put on partisan shirts, red and blue, and often took positions, I think, on air that they didn't actually believe and hadn't spent in a lifetime defending. That was the opposite on Firing Line. That's why if you go back and you watch Firing Line episodes now, you can't help but feel like you've learned a ton in the space of watching 1 hour. There are not many television programs today, I would argue, that allow you to come away feeling that way.
Yes. Everything you said is completely true, but it's also true, I think, that Bill was a natural epigrammatist, coiner of aphorisms, wasn't he? They occur in his articles, and sometimes summing them up, and also they occur in his speeches. In fact, sometimes, as with Oscar Wilde, they get him into trouble in his debate at the Oxford Union and that Cambridge Union, I think, where he's dealing with the question of race and so on. He says things which he later has to regret, but that they're memorable because he's got the knack of packing a huge argument into a 5 or 6 words, and of course that was one of the many skills he had as a writer. Because we haven't talked about things like Blackford Oaks and other things. And the fact that he wrote a play at one point. I always felt that Bill's attitude was Chesterton's. If a thing is worth doing, it's worth doing badly. Most of the things he did well. But something he wanted to do, he would give it a try.
Steve mentioned earlier, there was a time where National Review was the place that you went if you wanted to be published as a conservative, if you wanted your voice heard as a conservative. It was because, first, John was supportive of it, Rich knew it was important, But ultimately, when Bill was alive, this is his baby, so Bill better be supportive of it. And as much as he may have bemoaned the fact that we had to make arguments, shorter arguments and everything, he also appreciated we had to do it. We had to be there. And so he was engaged until the end, sending, I actually have a memory of being at CPAC one day and Rich is sending me email messages about Bill reading what we're posting in the corner. And I'm thinking, I cannot believe Bill Buckley is reading what we're posting in the corner right now on CPAC. But he was that engaged until fairly late on. And was also, I remember so grateful too as well when his wife died online, there were a lot of tributes, and that was a great gift to him, I think.
I know he was once asked what was the most important thing that he had done, and he said that it was the founding of National Review. And I think that's not only because it was this extraordinary magazine which had such an influence, but again, going back to the point that I made earlier, which was that it was the epicenter of this conservative movement. And if you look back at when he was out there trying to raise the money to start National Review, he talked about making this new magazine a formative journal which would have as much influence on the politics of America as the New Republic and the nation had done with the New Deal. So he always had in mind that he wanted to be, as much as he could, promoting and pushing and building and developing a movement, a conservative movement. And that, of course, is still very much with us today.
If I could just add to that, it's important to remember who Buckley was pitching his arguments to. And National Review was founded in 1955. The previous year, Joe McCarthy, who Buckley defended, was censured by the United States Senate, and McCarthyism collapsed. And conservatism faced the real threat of going down with Joe McCarthy. In some ways, the founding of National Review was an attempt to make conservatism respectable again. And it was very important for both Buckley and his senior editor, James Burnham, that they pitched the journal to an educated class. They felt, just like the editors of the New Republic, that the only way that you were going to make generational change in American politics and society is if you captured the elites. And if you read the early issues of National Review, as I've done, it's fascinating because early on, a letter writer corresponds to the magazine and says, you guys are hoity-toity. There's too much academic stuff. You're publishing Richard Weaver. You're publishing Russell Kirk. Get to the nitty-gritty. And Frank Meyer, who went on to become one of the most important editors of the magazine, who really kind of developed this theory that Bill embodied of the unity of libertarian economics and traditional social thought. Frank Meyer, at that time not employed by the magazine, wrote back in to this reader and said, no, we have to go to the educated. And it's interesting to compare that to the situation today, because I think now what we've gone to is a conservative movement, mainly because of the political currents that Buckley revealed and prospered, sometimes I think has an attitude of, we don't need the elites anymore. And it's not to say that the elites aren't corrupt, they are, but you can't replace an elite with no elite. And that mission of creating a conservative elite still remains.
Well, on the same point, one should mention some of the really remarkable names. You've mentioned James Burnham, for example. I mean, Burnham's reputation rises with every passing year. The world is conforming to his most pessimistic predictions. And I think if you look at the argument he had with Orwell, he beats Orwell. He wins that argument. You look at Richard Newhouse, one of whose many great aphorisms was, once orthodoxy becomes optional, it will sooner or later be prohibited. And Richard was, of course, a Lutheran. And we only, National Review, we have the tradition under Bill of only appointing non-Catholics to be our religion editor. He felt it was important that even though we weren't actually a Catholic magazine, we should demonstrate that we weren't confessional in any way. And yet, so we had some very distinguished religion editors. Richard, of course, spoiled his theme by becoming a Catholic in the course of being religion editor. You mentioned Meyer. I think that he was an extremely important figure. I mean, it wasn't just that the magazine had these great figures. These great figures went on to do other things, to found First Things magazine, to give advice to the government, to the administration and the CIA on how to fight the Cold War. That was Burnham. I mean, it was, in every way you say, it was a magazine of the elite. But the important thing is, it didn't preach as an elite. It, in fact, attacked the elites for their corruption and for their lack of eliteness, so to speak. I mean, it was in many respects, it was a counter-elite. And as such, that's what we definitely do need today, because we certainly don't have the kind of elites that we need to make the country prosper and succeed in the world.
Just the other day, I was watching a firing line with Father Newhouse and Bill and Episcopal Bishop John Spong, who had just written a book on sexual license, and you watch Bill and Father Newhouse, and you just want to have them over. You want to be in their company. You want to be like them, you know, and that was part of the magic of it all.
Well, an African Episcopal bishop tried to exorcise Bishop Spong at one of the Anglican meetings, and so Bill didn't do a good enough job there, we have to say.
You know, as much of it as of someone who did appeal to the elites, and Matt, you're absolutely right, with particularly those founding years. At the same time, he also understood the importance of reaching out in a broader way, in a broader circle, through firing line. And that was, again, and of course with his syndicated column 3 times a week and with all the other things that he did. So again, he was sort of combining both, wasn't he? Trying to keep always in mind the idea of converting the elites or creating them, and at the same time reaching out to that broader audience, creating the climate in which conservative ideas would be adopted and would be implemented, particularly in politics. Let's see, shall we try some Q&A? We have a gentleman here.
Excuse me.
My name is Cammy Butt, and my question is to Mr. Hayes. I was just wondering that if you know anything about Mr. William Buckley's relationship with the Gore Vidal, who, as you know, has very elite background, very rich financially. But he was kind of socialist, but they were during the same time frame. So I just wondered that if you know any interaction between them, are there differences? I'm asking this question because I have seen his debate with Reagan. Even they have little difference, but they were very friendly during the debate. And my question to Mr. Sullivan is, as you know, I have a South Asian background, and there are a lot of South Asians who love Britain because it has very liberal welfare system. I just wonder that if somebody, if you have a conservative in Great Britain who would recommend to the welfare recipient what Mr. Buckley recommended in New York in 60s about cleaning job. Thanks.
Go ahead.
Okay. Well, I don't know that I can answer the question effectively about the current situation, but I do say that if you look at Margaret Thatcher's record and you take into account the differences between the United States and Britain in various ways, you'll see that she was, in a practical sense, a kind of Buckleyite conservative. Of course, I think she would reasonably argue she should be called a Thatcherite, but but nonetheless, the two people, both of them got on well with each other. They saw more or less eye to eye, not on every topic, of course, but the same kind of argument that pitted Bill against, say, Richard Nixon was the same kind of argument that pitted her against Edward Heath. So you do get those comparisons. I forget the first part of the question, but maybe.
Long and storied disagreements between Bill and Gore Vidal,
yes.
of course. One of I would say his main rivals
yes.
over the years. had an opportunity to make Gore Vidal look as foolish as I think history now suggests he was on many occasions.
Yes.
But it's also something, Bill, that wasn't happy people knew him for.
Right.
And increasingly, I mentioned earlier that documentary, that is what people know about him, and that shouldn't be, because that wasn't actually characteristic of him.
Right.
I mean, he could eviscerate liberals' arguments, but he also cultivated friendships.
Well, sure, John
and heard
Kenneth
people
Galbraith,
out.
I mean,
Oh,
many
exactly.
others, very good friends.
Exactly, Abe Rosenthal. We could go through lists.
Also, I think Gore Vidal is a wonderful illustration of the marriage in the 20th century between socialism and snobbery, and he was the perfect example of it, really.
Yes. This is directed to Matthew/Paul, because I was interested in your comments about Bill's potential ability to adapt to Twitter, even with all of its shortcomings on the number of characters and so forth. I think he could have done that. And to add to your delightful quotes, in 1968, Bill was asked who he would favor as the ideal Republican ticket. And he said Ronald Reagan and Jacob Javits, the liberal Republican from New York, with the explicit understanding that if President Reagan were to die in office, Vice President Javits would throw himself on the funeral pyre in grief. So that underscores your comment about his ability to weaponize his wit and use it in a way that he could make broader points when he wanted to.
And of course, the great benefit of being able to do that is humor is utterly disarming to the opponent. And when you make a quip like that, one has to laugh. And then if you're debating Buckley, well, how does one respond? I mean, it's hard. Gore Vidal, of course, was also famous for being witty as well. And the history of those debates is, by the time of Buckley's outburst, he was quite frustrated with a variety of things, including the scheduling. But that's one example where you see kind of two wits going toe-to-toe, and it ended badly. Usually it worked out in Buckley's favor.
The problem with Buckley and Twitter, though, is with 280 characters, he would be reduced sometimes to two-word tweets, given the way that
my first action when I ran the Political Interest Club in high school was to get the National Review in the school library. And I went on to do the Coalition Peace Through Strength, and I was at the 45th anniversary of the CPAC. So I've been a conservative forever since then. Do you have stories of how he inspired young people like myself? It has to be in the millions of how many people he's inspired to go the conservative line.
Listen, I came across George Nash, the eminent conservative historian, once said that Bill Buckley may have written more private correspondence than any human being in history, which gives you some sense of all of the lives he touched. For other people, you would think, well, that's an exaggeration, but not for Buckley. One thing I haven't mentioned is his ability not only to inspire people, but also to mentor them. And I think it's one testament to his capaciousness that his protégés include everyone from Gary Wills to David Brooks to Charles Kessler of the Claremont Review to Ross Douthat. It's an expanse. And he was always willing, he said, and when he had to list his likes, he always elevated the ability to write good prose over one's politics. Brooks famously got his job at National Review after he wrote a parody of Buckley in the Chicago Maroon paper, where he said as a youth, Buckley founded two magazines, the National Buckley and the Buckley Review, and then he merged them into the Buckley Buckley.
Yes. Incidentally, Bill also, of course, started the careers of many people who were either on the left or who were in the world of culture. I mean, Joan Didion is probably the best example, but there are many, and that was precisely for the reason that Matt just gave. And the other, and what that points to is something else, namely, Bill was so influential because he wasn't just a political writer. He was a cultural figure. I mean, he was a major figure whom people knew about, responded to, generally liked in American life, even when they weren't particularly interested in politics. But he stood for something good and amusing, sharp and witty, and people instinctively took to him.
Bill was also tireless, and so I think it's probably countless the number of people who have stories like yours, where he inspired so much of their activism, whether their careers, etc. And one of the things we haven't talked all that much about is how he was going to college campuses all the time, and so many people had an interaction with him, maybe on their college campus. And if you go back and you read some of those speeches he gave to the intercollegiate studies, or whatever it was, Young Americans for Freedom, he's always talking about, inevitably in the course of those speeches, he talks about gratitude. He talks about, a couple of years ago, maybe it was a year or two after Bill died, I was speaking at a conference and they asked me to talk about him as a Catholic journalist. And I said I was going to read everything he ever wrote on the Catholic Church, and I'm still doing that. And the reason I bring that up is because in these speeches too, so often he talked about the Beatitudes. He talked about like things stemming back to Bethlehem. I was really struck by it. I didn't even appreciate it. I sort of vaguely knew it because I was attracted to that as a young person. But that was actually at the core of the message that he was trying to give people. And then if you read some of these speeches or go back, because you've probably read most of them, you know, he talks about music and he talks about beauty, and you start to appreciate that to be, if you're inspired by Bill Buckley, you're inspired by more than politics. You're inspired more than the words. It's this whole world view that I think we probably need to tap into more. And at the basis, he always talked about the patrimony. It's sort of the opposite of the idea that we are the ones we have been waiting for. You know, there are great things that have been in our past, so let's tap into them again. Mm.
Who were some of Buckley's influences during his life? Obviously, Knock in his youth and Wilmer Kendall at Yale, but do you have any insight on who some of the influences throughout his life might have been?
I think the most important was his father, William Buckley Sr. And I think when you read about Buckley's life, you see just how much of his politics came from being at his dad's table. And it was through his dad that he met Albert J. Knock, you mentioned, the very elitist libertarian thinker who conceived of the idea of the remnant. You know, the early conservatives were extremely pessimistic for good reason, right? But they had this idea that the battle was more or less lost. Whittaker Chambers, at the end of witness rights, that he had joined by becoming a conservative anti-communist, he had joined the losing side. Chambers was another great influence on Buckley. Kendall, who you mentioned, was his college professor and tutor who helped him write his first two books, God and Man at Yale, and then McCarthy and His Enemies. Really kind of the source, I think, of a lot of the majoritarian instinct in American conservatism, the nascent populist instinct in American conservatism. Burnham, who's been mentioned here, was probably, Buckley called him the greatest intellectual influence on the magazine as senior editor. And a lot of the ideological formation, I know we're against ideology, but ideological formation of the magazine was through Burnham. Yes. I'd say those were some of the biggest influences. Later, he got to know the neoconservatives, and I think they also influenced his thought in the 60s and 70s.
It was very important to Bill when he was starting National Review to get Russell Kirk on board. Russell had just had written The Conservative Mind in 1953, which, as you know, gave them the movement our name. We became the conservative movement, really, because of the conservative mind. So Bill flew off to Macuston, Michigan, and said, I've got to enlist Russell Kirk and this man who has written this very important seminal work. And they met, and Russell was not quite sure that he did want to join up. And so, well, let's have dinner. So they went off, and they didn't have gin and tonics. What they had were Tom Collinses. And they had not just one, not just two, but I don't know, maybe a half a dozen Tom Collinses, at the end of which this discussion going on, Bill trying to make the sale, close the deal, and finally Russell said, well, all right, I won't join your masthead, but I will write you a column on higher education. And Bill sort of, great sigh of relief, but by that time ready to collapse, sort of fell into bed and fell asleep. The next morning he got up to have breakfast, and there was Russell coming down the stairs after having written the latest chapter of his latest book. That was an example for Bill Buckley to continue to try to be that person who was always writing. So he was reaching out to traditional conservatives, to libertarian conservatives, and to anti-communists. And with that, he was able to create this extraordinary masthead, and then to keep it together. We haven't talked about his diplomatic skills, his ability to sort of persuade people of varying ideas and various ideologies to come together and to stay together as well. And he did that through diplomacy and also a little bit of flattery too as well. He knew when to sort of say that so-and-so, that was a terrific piece that you wrote.
One thing that strikes you when you go back to the old National Reviews is how contentious the magazine was. For many decades, they had a column called The Open Question, where anyone on the masthead could write in and disagree with the position of the editors or of the contributors. And it was through this process of debate that Harry Jaffa, the founder of the Claremont School, came into the conservative movement. And Buckley, of course, had the wonderful quip about Jaffa, which is, if you think disagreeing with Harry Jaffa is hard, try agreeing with him.
Yeah.
We've heard a bit about Buckley's relationships with people that are on the other side of the political spectrum, and we've also heard about the way that he was would take down the arguments of the other side. So in this time where so much of the right seems to be focused on fighting and being a strong fighter and civil wars and all of this. How this is for anyone on the panel. How did Buckley navigate those waters where he could still, he could be a very fierce ideological competitor and yet still be a very good friend?
Well, I think one thing we haven't mentioned actually is his ability to set boundaries. So I mentioned how the creation of National Review was in a way to reclaim conservatism as a intellectual force in American life. But very soon after that, they were confronted by various schismatic tendencies, as Buckley might say. So you had the Randians, right? And you had the kind of radical libertarians represented by Murray Rothbard. And then you had, of course, the John Birch Society. And so that first 15 years of National Review was spent kind of saying, that's not us. And so, despite his great ability for friendship that transcended partisan or ideological lines, Buckley did make enemies, many of them. And what we've seen, I think, in the last 10 years, and most recently in the last 4 years, is that this counter-tradition of conservatism was kind of always running alongside National Review conservatism. And then the dam broke. So he'd probably be back in the trenches now, fighting again.
Yes. He would certainly set boundaries and did. He was once asked, is it possible to be an atheist and to be a conservative? And he said, yes, it would be possible. But you cannot be a God hater. That was his phrase, a God hater, and to be a conservative. And he aimed that directly at Ayn Rand. And so the famous meeting between Ayn Rand and Bill Buckley at a cocktail party in New York City, this was before the famous review by Whittaker Chambers of Atlas Shrugged. And Rand saw Bill and walked right up to him and said, "Mr. Buckley, you are too intelligent to believe in God. There is no such thing as God." And Bill said, "Oh, that's very interesting." And he went away thinking, now how can I possibly convince her otherwise? And so he said, I know. So he began sending Ayn Rand Christmas cards in Latin. But it didn't work. She didn't convert. And so then he assigned the famous review of Atlas Shrugged by Whittaker Chambers, which certainly read her out of the movement at the time.
Yes, can I just say that there's no doubt that Bill made enemies. There's absolutely clear. And although in general he was the spirit of generosity, I think that part of that was religious, but it's a generosity which overflows from outside of religion too. I mean, he was good-natured. He promoted people. He wanted to win over enemies, as you said, persuade people. But I think that review by Whittaker Chambers is a very. I mean, I personally think I might not have run that review. It goes too far, and his obituary of the paleo-libertarian Murray Rothbard is a very tough, unforgiving obituary. There's no doubt about that. And I was the editor at the time, and that was one of the few occasions when he and I had a serious argument about it. He obviously won the argument, but I didn't give up. I did not like that obituary. I thought it was unfair to Murray, whom I knew actually personally and liked, even though I'm not a libertarian or anything close to it. So we shouldn't forget there's a tough, unyielding side to Bill, and he wouldn't have succeeded as he did if that side hadn't been there. And that's why he was prepared to take positions that were very sharp and bold and outraged the left, which happened again and again. So we're dealing with a very complex personality, but the spirit of generosity is what defines him more than anything else, and that spirit was shown not only in public controversy, but it was also shown in private benefactions. All of the things that Bill did for people that no one knows about. I know about some of them, and they were remarkable. And they're the kind of things which we should all like to think would be on to our credit, on our deathbed.
One of my favorites of those acts of generosity is what he did for Ernest Vandenhoeg, who was having some health problems, and his doctor said to him, "Well, you really got to do more exercising. What you ought to do is to get on a treadmill more often." And Vandenhoeg said, "Well, I don't have one." And he related this story to Bill, who said, "Oh, that's very interesting." And the next day, one was delivered to his home, to Ernest Vandenhoeg's home in New York City, and with a note from Bill saying, "Here, get treading." And so many things like that. And it would make was one more book that NR Institute can publish is all the various acts of generosity that he did in benefaction. That would be extraordinary.
Ernest was a good friend of mine. I should dearly love to have seen him on a treadmill.
You may have waited a long time.
Well, I'm not sure that was a generosity. That may have been something else.
And just to pick up on the point that Catherine made earlier, I mean, politics was only one part of who he was, and it certainly wasn't the most important part. It wasn't even close to the most important part. So I think that helps answer your question. And then the other way I'd address your question is that the debate, it seems to me, for Bill Buckley was an end in of itself. I mean, he ultimately wanted to persuade people. He sought to persuade people. He spent most of his life trying to persuade people. But he loved the debate for the sake of the debate. And you could see that. I mean, you couldn't watch a firing line without understanding just how much he loved the process. And he loved the engagement. He loved the exchange of ideas. And you watch that and you want to agree with him. I mean, you want to be part of what he's promoting. And I think even people who with whom he had fierce debates over the years came to like him personally for precisely that reason. It's become, I mean, it may be one of the easiest cliches is that he was a happy warrior. I mean, I think that was in almost every single 10th anniversary remembrance of his passing. But it's true. I mean, if it describes anybody, it describes him. And I think that people were drawn to him, many times his enemies, but also people within the conservative movement who might have had different views on an issue here or there, but broadly were fighting sort of in the same direction.
There's also humility about him too, which came through in a lot of the testimonies that people were telling me in the days after he died. And I remember, so one of my favorite of his books is Nearer My God, which was probably the one he was most hesitant to write. People wanted a faith book, but he wasn't a theologian, and Father Newhouse even said, you know, there are parts he would cringe through because Bill was not a theologian. But Chuck Colson said that the last chapter is the most important one to read, and that was about his mom. You mentioned his dad, so I want to mention his mom too, who was an incredible influence on his life, and to not understand that part of it is to not have a complete picture of Bill too. And I think she influenced that humility a lot.
Well, we could spend probably the next 4 or 5 hours talking about Bill Buckley and not even begin to get to the bottom of him anywhere near. He was such an extraordinary person. He worked night and day for some, not always working. He was also playing too part of the time, but he was dedicated and committed all those years. Once asked, why do you work so hard? Well, of course, he had a quip, and he said, well, I'm easily bored. But a more serious answer he gave when he was asked that question was, I want to give back to the country which has given me so much. And that goes to the point that Catherine was talking about, the feeling of gratitude which he had. And he was a person who was so blessed in so many ways and tried to give it back. So please, let's thank the National Review Institute for organizing this. And of course, my favorite think tank, the Heritage Foundation. And to Catherine, John, Stephen, and Matt, many, many, many thanks.
Well, it's very pleasant, wasn't it? Yeah.